A church bell tolls through the London fog. That single sound was a command, setting in motion 1,000 hidden dramas before the sun had fully risen. The Victorian morning was a world of strict ritual and silent labor, a daily performance where every gesture held a secret meaning. By the end of this journey, you will see history not in dusty dates, but in the steam of a shaving bowl and the soot on a factory worker's shirt. We will uncover why a lady's corset was laced before dawn, and what the clatter of a milkmaid's pail really signified for the city's survival. What does your own morning routine say about the hidden rules of our world today? The bell had not yet tolled for him. In the grand houses of Mayfair, the first soul awake was rarely the master of the house. His day began not with an alarm, but with a soft knock. A valet entered, a man whose entire profession was the careful management of another man's person. He would draw back the heavy curtains with precise timing, allowing a calculated amount of gray London light to fall across the bed. The room was already warm, a fire having been lit by a housemaid an hour before. This was a waking designed to avoid any jarring sensation, any unpleasant shock to the system. From the very first moment of consciousness, a gentleman was to be insulated from the crude mechanics of daily life. His first task was to submit to the razor. Shaving was not a quick chore, it was a silent, perilous ballet. The valet would prepare a porcelain bowl of hot water, working a cake of shaving soap into a thick, warm lather with a badger hair brush. The straight razor, honed to a lethal edge, was then drawn across a leather strop with a rhythmic, whispering sound. There was an immense trust in this act. One man held a blade to another's throat, and the entire social contract of the upstairs world rested on his steady hand. A single slip could mean a cut, a scar, a social embarrassment that lasted a lifetime. This ritual was about more than removing stubble. It was about the mastery of the self, achieved through the skilled hands of a servant. Then came the armor. Dressing a Victorian gentleman was an operation that could involve dozens of separate items, each with a specific name and purpose. It started with fine linen undergarments, then wool or silk stockings held up by garters. Trousers were buttoned onto a suspender system. A stiff, detachable collar was fastened around the neck with studs, a device that forced the chin up and dictated a posture of aloof dignity. Then the waistcoat, often richly embroidered, followed by the morning coat itself, tailored to perfection. Cuffs were linked, a pocket watch secured, a handkerchief folded just so into a breast pocket. Every piece was a layer of identity. This was not simply getting dressed. It was assembling a public persona, piece by meticulous piece. And what you assembled depended entirely on the hour. Before luncheon, a gentleman wore morning dress a slightly less formal cut, often in darker, somber colors like gray or black, suitable for business calls or a stroll in the park. Full dress, with its white tie and tailcoat, was reserved for evening. The social code was unforgiving. To appear in morning dress at an evening event was a grave insult, a sign of profound ignorance or deliberate contempt. The message was clear. Your clothing announced your intentions, your status, and your understanding of the world's invisible rules before you uttered a single word. By the time he descended the staircase for breakfast, the gentleman was a finished product. No trace of the vulnerable, sleeping man remained. He emerged composed, impeccable, and seemingly effortless. This was the great illusion of his morning. The immense labor, the skill, the quiet industry of multiple servants. The valet, the maid who lit the fire, the bootblack who polished his shoes, all of it was designed to vanish. leaving only the image of a man born to command his day. His ease was their exhausting work, and as he sat down to his kippers and toast, another, far more urgent drama was already reaching its climax in the streets below. While the gentleman was a portrait of controlled austerity, his wife's mourning was an exercise in constructed artistry. Her domain was the dressing room, a private sanctuary where she was attended not by a valet, but by her lady's maid. This was a relationship built on an intimate trust of a different kind. The maid was confidante, artist, and engineer, responsible for crafting her mistress' public face from the foundation upward. The first and most time-consuming act was the hair. Victorian women's hairstyles were architectural marvels, not quick arrangements. The maid would begin by sectioning the hair, then heating heavy metal curling irons directly in the flame of a small lamp or candle. She tested the iron's temperature on a piece of paper, a crucial step to avoid the smell of scorched hair, a social disaster. Then, with practiced speed, she wound sections of hair around the iron, creating a series of tight, springy curls. These were not the end goal, but the raw material. Once the hair was uniformly curled, the real sculpting began. The maid would brush the curls out, then painstakingly pin and twist them in the desired style. Perhaps a sleek chignon at the nape of the neck, or elaborate braids coiled over the ears. This intricate pinning, invisible from the front, used dozens of hairpins to create a structure that had to withstand an entire day of movement. The process was a silent marathon, often consuming over an hour of the morning. Every pin placed was a defense against the humiliation of a stray lock or a collapsing coil in public. Next came the complexion. A lady's face was a canvas of respectability, and the palette was deliberately limited. Heavy cosmetics, like rouge or kohl, were the trademarks of actresses and courtesans, women who lived by public display. For a respectable woman, the goal was an illusion of natural, flawless pallor. The only acceptable enhancement was a light dusting of rice powder or finely milled pearl powder, applied with a soft puff to minimize shine and even the skin tone. This was a careful performance of purity. To be seen with a visibly powdered face was vulgar, but to achieve a porcelain, matte finish required that very powder. It was a secret everyone knew but no one acknowledged. Finally, the foundation was laid for the architecture of her dress, beginning with the layers beneath. The lady would step into a chemise of fine linen or cotton, then long embroidered drawers. Then came the corset. This was not a solitary struggle with laces. The maid would hold the corset open, her mistress would step into it, and then the meticulous tightening would begin. The maid pulled the laces, not in one brutal yank, but in a series of firm, gradual increments, often with the lady bracing herself against a bedpost or a specially designed dressing table. The goal was not the wasp waist of extreme fashion, but a specific, smooth silhouette, a long, graceful line from shoulder to hip that provided the necessary form for the heavy skirts to come. This was about structure, not just style. The corset was the mannequin upon which the elaborate gown would be hung. Each layer, from the hairpins to the corset laces, was a silent statement of discipline, wealth, and social standing. Her finished appearance was a masterpiece of subtle codes, a language spoken in ribbons, powder, and posture. And as she glided down to join her husband for breakfast, she presented a vision of effortless grace, a living testament to the hour of intricate, hidden labor that had preceded it. But far below their quiet meal in the servants' hall, a very different kind of breakfast was already underway, fueled by an entirely different clock. The corset was the silent engine of the Victorian silhouette, a garment wrapped in as much myth as whalebone. Its purpose was not merely to shrink the waist, but to create an entirely new shape, a rigid, inverted cone that redistributed weight and provided a solid foundation for those immense, heavy skirts. The process of lacing was a study in gradual pressure. A maid would rarely, if ever, perform a single dramatic pull. Instead, she used a method called lacing in, taking up the slack incrementally, often while her mistress exhaled, moving from the top and bottom toward the center. This created an even, custom fit. The idea of fainting couches being necessary for breathless women is largely a later exaggeration. For most women of the middle and upper classes, the goal was a reduction of perhaps 2 to 3 inches from their natural measurement, achieving a smooth line, not an impossible 18-inch waist. The corset itself was not a monolith. There were many types, each telling a different story. The so-called health corset, lightly boned with cord or flexible steel, was promoted for young girls and women seeking more freedom of movement. Then there were the working-class corsets, made of sturdier, cheaper materials like cotton caudal, designed for durability and back support during long hours of manual labor. At the far end of the spectrum was the practice of tight lacing, a controversial pursuit that aimed for extreme reduction. This was a subculture sensationalized in satirical cartoons and medical journals, but it was never the norm. The vast majority of women wore corsets for structure and posture, not for drastic deformity. The debate around the corset was fierce, even in its own time. Doctors warned of compressed organs, displaced ribs, and weakened muscles. Reformers, often aligned with the growing movement for women's rights, decried it as a symbol of physical constraint that mirrored social oppression. Yet many women defended their corsets, citing the support they provided for the back under the weight of multiple petticoats and skirts. For them, it was an essential piece of engineering. The social symbolism was inescapable. A properly laced corset enforced an upright, modest posture. It represented discipline, self-control, and respectability. A woman's silhouette was a public resume of her character. To be without one was to be loose, both in body and in morals. The practical reality of wearing one was a learned skill. Women who wore corsets daily developed a different way of moving. They bent from the hips, not the waist. They sat upright on chairs, never slouching. They could, and did, engage in a wide range of activities: gardening, playing with children, even riding horses with the aid of a specialized riding corset. The garment was a framework that dictated motion, but it did not necessarily prevent it. To understand the Victorian woman, you must look past the myth of the fainting victim and see the adaptable individual within the structured form. And while the lady was being laced into her corset, the true physical labor of the morning was already reaching its peak, far from the dressing room, in the chill air of the city streets. 4 o'clock in the morning found the house in absolute darkness, but never in silence. While the family slept, the true clockwork of the household began its relentless turn in the basement. The servants' day started not with a gentle knock, but with the housemaid's own internal alarm, a dread of being late that was sharper than any bell. She rose in a tiny, frigid attic room, washing with cold water from a china jug and basin, and dressed swiftly in her uniform, a plain, dark dress, a white apron, and a cap. Her first duty was a descent into the heart of the house, the kitchen. There, she knelt before the massive cast iron range, a beast that demanded daily tribute. She cleared yesterday's ashes, laying fresh newspaper, kindling, and coal with ritual care before striking a match. The success of this fire was not a matter of comfort, but of survival for the household's entire day. No hot water, no cooked breakfast, no heated rooms above if this single flame refused to catch. Meanwhile, the boot boy was already at his station in a dim, stone-flagged scullery. Rows of shoes and boots, belonging to every member of the family, stood before him like a silent army. His world was the smell of polish and blacking, a paste made from soot, wax, and vinegar. He applied it with a brush, then buffed each boot to a high, mirror-like gloss with a soft cloth, his arms moving in a steady, rhythmic frenzy. His work was judged on reflection. A scuff mark was a personal failure. Down the hall, the most physically grueling task of the morning was already underway. The scullery maid, often the youngest and lowest in the household hierarchy, was responsible for water. There was no tap. She had to draw every bucket from a hand pump in the yard or a basement cistern, hauling the heavy, sloshing containers back inside to fill enormous copper kettles and pans for cooking and washing. Her arms and back ached with a constant, dull pain that was simply part of the morning. All of this labor was conducted under a rule of near total silence. Voices were hushed, doors were closed softly, footsteps were muffled on the stone floors. The upstairs world must not be disturbed. This quiet was enforced by a strict hierarchy. The butler and housekeeper were the generals. The cook was the monarch of the kitchen, and the head housemaid directed the footmen and junior maids with quiet authority. A junior maid would never address the butler unless spoken to first. This invisible structure ensured the machine operated smoothly, every cog knowing its place and its task. By the time the first gray light touched the upper windows, the downstairs world had already completed a full shift of work. Fires blazed, water boiled, shoes shone, and the kitchen hummed with the preparation of breakfast. The polished silver, the warmed plates, the crisp newspaper folded beside the master's chair. Each was a small, silent monument to hours of unseen effort. The family's graceful, effortless morning was an illusion built on a foundation of pre-dawn labor. And as the smell of frying bacon began to drift through the house, another critical morning ritual was concluding outside, one that determined whether the city itself would function or falter. The housemaid's fire was just the opening act of a silent, grueling marathon. Her next task was to erase all traces of the night before the family stirred. In each occupied bedroom, she performed a precise, physically demanding ritual. First, she would take up the heavy hearth rug, rolling it back to protect it from ash. Then, kneeling on the cold floor, she emptied the grate of yesterday's ashes, sifting through them carefully for any unburned coals to be reused. She laid fresh newspaper, kindling, and coal with the efficiency of a soldier loading a rifle, then struck a match. A successful light meant warmth and hot water for that room. A failed one meant a chilly reception and a mark against her name. She repeated this process in every single room with a fireplace, from the master's bedroom to the chilly nursery, her knees aching and her hands blackened with soot. But the fire was only the beginning of the room's transformation. Next came the battle against dust, fought with surprisingly humble weapons. Before vacuum cleaners, the secret to cleaning a thick wool carpet was damp tea leaves. The maid would sprinkle used, dried tea leaves across the entire floor. These coarse leaves acted as a gentle abrasive, grabbing and holding the dust as she swept. She moved in long, rhythmic strokes with a stiff, bristled broom, gathering the now dusty leaves into a pan. The room filled with the faint, earthy scent of tea, a smell of cleanliness that masked the labor behind it. Every surface then demanded attention. She polished mahogany dressing tables and oak wardrobes with beeswax and turpentine, rubbing in circular motions until the wood gleamed. Mirrors were wiped with vinegar and newspaper for a streak-free shine. Every candlestick, picture frame, and doorknob was dusted. Her goal was not just cleanliness, but a state of perfect, polished readiness. The most back-breaking part of her routine, however, was water. Each bedroom contained a washstand with a large ceramic bowl and jug. It was the housemaid's duty to fill them. There were no pipes leading to these rooms. She had to haul heavy copper cans of hot water all the way from the basement kitchen, up multiple flights of narrow, often unlit servant stairs. A full water can could weigh over 20 pounds. She would climb carefully, the hot metals straining her arms, the steam dampening her cap, trying not to spill a precious drop on the polished stair treads. In each room, she poured the steaming water into the family's jug, leaving a fresh cake of soap and a neatly folded towel. This simple act of providing warm water for washing represented an immense expenditure of human energy. By the time she finished, her muscles would be trembling, her uniform damp with sweat and condensation. When the family finally awoke, they entered a world that seemed to have magically refreshed itself. The air was warm, the floors were spotless, the furniture glowed, and warm water awaited them. There was no evidence of the hour of intense, silent labor that had made it so. The pristine environment was a deliberate illusion, a stage set before the actors arrived. The housemaid's entire morning was a performance of erasure, removing the mess of yesterday and the evidence of her own hard work, all to sustain the fiction of effortless, timeless order. And as the first family member rang a bell for breakfast, she was already descending the stairs, her own marathon complete, just as the city outside launched its own frantic struggle to feed millions. The children's world was a separate kingdom, governed by its own laws. High up in the house, often on the top floor near the servants' quarters, lay the nursery suite. Here, the day began not with a soft knock, but with the firm, kind authority of the nanny. She was a figure of immense power in this small domain, more present in the children's daily lives than their own parents. Her first task was to enforce the morning's central tenet, fortitude. Children, even very young ones, were often washed in cold water. This was not a matter of convenience, but of philosophy. The chill was believed to harden the constitution and build moral character, teaching the child to endure minor discomfort without complaint. It was a lesson in stoicism before breakfast. Dressing followed a rigid protocol. Clothing was miniature armor designed for propriety, not play. Little girls were laced into stiff, embroidered dresses with layers of petticoats, their hair tightly braided. Boys were put into sailor suits or miniature versions of their father's attire, complete with stiff collars that scraped the neck. Movement was restricted by design. Running, climbing, or spontaneous play were physically discouraged by the very clothes they wore. Every action was supervised and structured. After washing and dressing, the children would kneel with the nanny or nursemaid for morning prayers. This instilled piety and quiet reflection, setting a tone of subdued obedience for the hours ahead. The most telling ritual of all was the formal parental greeting. Children did not simply run downstairs. They were prepared, inspected, and then presented to their mother and father, often only for a brief audience before breakfast. This moment was a performance of perfect behavior. They were to be seen, to speak only when spoken to, and to demonstrate the quiet discipline the nursery was meant to instill. The separation was profound. Parents might love their children deeply, but the Victorian ideal of family life was built on hierarchy and order, not constant companionship. The nursery was a world of routine, discipline, and emotional restraint, a training ground for the strict social roles these children would one day assume. While they practiced their quiet obedience, a far louder, more chaotic symphony of survival was playing out in the streets, a daily race against hunger that the entire city depended on. The clatter of silver domes being lifted announced the morning's true purpose. In the dining room, the sideboard was not merely a piece of furniture, it was a stage for a silent performance of abundance. Under gleaming silver chafing dishes, kept warm by tiny spirit lamps, lay a landscape of Victorian sustenance. There was kedgeree, a fragrant golden mound of spiced rice, flaked smoked fish, and boiled eggs, a legacy of the British Empire in India. There were deviled kidneys, sizzling in a peppery sauce, alongside rashers of bacon, poached eggs, and cold cuts of ham or tongue. Toast stood in racks, and pots of marmalade and butter completed the scene. This was not a served meal in the formal sense. It was a casual, self-service affair, often referred to as breakfast at the sideboard. Family members would help themselves, carrying their loaded plates to the table. Yet, for all its apparent informality, the ritual was laced with unspoken rules. Conversation was often minimal, focused on the day's practical plans. The newspaper, ironed by a servant to set the ink and prevent smudging, provided a sanctioned reason for silence. Etiquette dictated the use of the correct cutlery for each dish, and a gentleman would never begin eating before the lady of the house had taken her first bite. It was a meal of efficiency and subtle signaling, a demonstration that even in relaxation, order prevailed. The food itself was a map of empire and industry. The pepper in the kidneys came from distant colonies, the bacon from English farms, the tea from Assam or Ceylon. Every bite connected the quiet dining room to a vast, global network of trade and power. Downstairs, in the basement servants' hall, a very different kind of fuel was being consumed. The servants' breakfast was not a performance, it was a necessary pit stop in an unrelenting workday. Eaten in hurried shifts, depending on when their morning duties were complete, it was a hearty, simple meal. There might be a large bowl of porridge, thick slices of bread with dripping or margarine, and perhaps leftover potatoes from the previous night's dinner. Tea was strong, sweet, and served in sturdy mugs. There was no silver here, no choice of dishes. This was about calories and warmth, consumed quickly before the next round of chores, clearing the family's breakfast, washing the mountains of dishes, and beginning the preparations for luncheon. The contrast was stark. Upstairs, leisure was framed by ritual. Downstairs, necessity dictated the pace. One meal showcased global reach and disciplined ease. The other was a testament to local endurance and physical labor. Both tables, however, were united by a single, relentless force, the master clock of the Victorian day that waited for no one, already ticking toward the next appointment. A silver tray rested by the front door, holding more than paper, it held possibility. The Morning Post was not just mail, it was the day's first social dispatches, a physical internet arriving in envelopes. The ritual began with the letter itself, a craft performed with intention. Personal stationery, thick and creamy, was a mark of status, often embossed with a family crest or a monogram. The ink was permanent, the handwriting an art form learned through hours of practice. And the final seal was not a mere closure, it was a signature in wax. A stick of sealing wax would be held to a candle flame until a drop of vibrant red or deep black pooled, then pressed with a personalized signet ring, leaving an impression that was uniquely yours. To break that seal was to be granted entry into a private world. This was communication with weight and permanence, where every word had been considered, for there was no taking it back once the postman called. But for the most immediate social traffic, there existed a more ingenious system, the calling card. These were not business cards, they were social currency, miniature declarations of identity. A lady's card was typically smaller, with elegant script. A gentleman's was slightly larger and plainer. Their delivery was a precise ceremony. A visitor would present their card to the butler, who would place it on that same silver tray and carry it to the mistress of the house. She would then decide in a moment the fate of the social call. The card itself could convey complex messages without a single written word. If the visitor was actually at the door hoping to be received, the butler would turn down one corner of the card before presenting it. This signaled a personal visit. If the lady was not at home, a polite fiction everyone understood, the card was simply left as a record of the obligation fulfilled. Leaving cards after a dinner party or when new neighbors arrived was a required social duty, a way of saying you acknowledged their place in the world. This was the Victorian social media feed, managed each morning over the breakfast table. The pile of cards and letters told a story of alliances, obligations, and emerging scandals. An unexpected card from a certain family might prompt a whispered conversation. The absence of a card after a significant event could speak volumes. A silent digital unfriending in engraved cardboard. Mornings were for parsing this network, for deciding which calls to return, which invitations to accept, and which to quietly ignore. It was a constant, quiet game of social chess, where every move was recorded on a silver tray. And while this intricate dance of paper and politeness unfolded in the parlors, a parallel morning ritual of a much more urgent kind was reaching its frantic peak just outside the window, in the roar of the street. Her world was a room at the top of the stairs, a liminal space between the nursery and the drawing room. This was the domain of the governess, perhaps the most socially precarious figure in the entire Victorian household. She was a gentlewoman by birth and education, yet she worked for a salary. She dined with the children, not the family, and was certainly not welcome in the servants' hall. Her morning began in quiet isolation, dressing with the same care as the lady of the house, but in fabrics that were visibly mended and slightly out of fashion. Her uniform was her own faded gentility, a constant, silent reminder of a fortune lost, a father deceased, or a family failed. Her duty was to the schoolroom, a place of chalk dust and enforced discipline. Here, she presided over the children's academic and moral instruction, a task that began the moment their nursery breakfast was cleared. The curriculum was a reflection of her own trapped position. For the girls, she taught the delicate art of embroidery, turning canvas into floral landscapes with silk thread, a skill meant to display patience and decorative talent. She guided small, clumsy fingers across the piano keys, drilling scales until a simple sonatina could be played without error. For musical accomplishment was a necessary ornament for a young lady, and she conducted lessons in French or Italian, the languages of culture, her own accent a carefully preserved asset. For the boys, before they were sent away to boarding school, she drilled the basics of geography, history, and scripture, preparing them for a world she would never govern. Every lesson was underscored by a more critical, unspoken one, the reinforcement of propriety, posture, and polite conversation. Her own manners had to be impeccable, a living model of the refinement she was hired to instill. Yet her authority was fragile, borrowed from the parents, and easily undermined by a spoiled child who knew she could not truly complain. Her salary was a pittance, often paid quarterly, and saving from it was nearly impossible. She had no pension, no security. A single misstep, a perceived impertinence, or simply the children growing up, could leave her without a reference and without a home. Her entire existence was a performance of ladylike grace under the grinding pressure of economic necessity. She was a living bridge between two worlds, respected by neither, essential to both, her mourning a quiet tragedy of wasted potential and dignified survival. And as she corrected a French verb, the city beyond the window was conducting its own harsh lessons in the School of Commerce, where the penalty for failure was not a poor mark, but starvation. The governess's quiet grammar lesson was a world away from the urgent clatter now filling the street. For the middle-class man, the morning's true test began the moment he stepped outside his own front door. He lived in a neat suburban villa, a symbol of hard-won respectability, but his life was measured by the distance between that green tranquility and the soot-choked heart of the city. His first act was a silent consultation. He drew a heavy silver pocket watch from his waistcoat, its chain gleaming, and snapped open the hunter case with a practiced thumb. This was not a casual glance. It was a calculation. The watch was synchronized with the railway's clock, and its hands dictated the precise minute he must depart to catch his omnibus or train. A delay of 2 minutes could mean a missed connection, a late arrival at the office, and a black mark in the ledger of his professional reputation. Time was no longer a natural rhythm of light and shadow. It was a commodity bought in seconds and spent on travel. His uniform was his armor for this daily campaign. Over his morning suit, he donned a dark frock coat, cut long and formal. Then came the top hat, a cylinder of sleek black silk that added a full foot to his stature, a portable monument to his dignity. With a final pat to his pockets, ensuring his notebook, pens, and luncheon voucher were secure, he embarked. The horse-drawn omnibus was a rolling microcosm of the new social order. He paid his fare and climbed to the open-air upper deck, the cheaper seats, where the air was fresher but the weather unforgiving. Here, clerks, shop managers, and junior businessmen sat shoulder to shoulder, a silent fraternity bound by shared purpose and shared discomfort. The vehicle lurched and swayed over the cobblestones, a bone-jarring progress through streets that grew denser and louder with every passing mile. Then the city itself descended upon him. The fog, a greasy yellow blend of coal smoke and river mist, swallowed buildings whole. Out of this gloom emerged a cacophony that assaulted the senses. The iron-shod wheels of drays and carriages created a deafening, continuous roar. Street hawkers shouted their wares, costermongers crying out prices for oysters or muffins. The air grew thick and gritty. With every breath, he tasted the city's primary product, soot. It was a particulate rain, a constant fallout from a million coal fires. His crisp white collar, fastened so carefully that morning, was its primary target. By the time he descended from the omnibus, a gray shadow would already be settling into the linen's weave. This was a constant losing battle. A gentleman might carry a spare paper collar in his pocket, a flimsy shield against the grime, knowing that by afternoon he would be visibly marked by his environment. His commute was a journey through the engine of progress itself, a baptism of filth and noise that was the price of participation in the modern world. He arrived at his office not just as a man, but as a document of his journey, his clothing bearing the indelible signature of the industrial age. And as he hung his hat and brushed the ash from his sleeves, another army was already dispersing from the city's heart, their work done while he slept, leaving behind the very substance that now soiled his cuffs. The middle-class commuter's collar was a canvas of urban grit, but for the shopkeeper, the morning's first task was to erase that very evidence from his own doorstep. Before the first customer could even think of crossing his threshold, he had to perform a public declaration of readiness. This began in the cold, pre-dawn quiet, with the heavy, rhythmic clatter of wooden shutters being taken down. Each panel was weighty and unwieldy, secured by iron bolts the night before against thieves and vagrants. Lowering them to the pavement was a physical announcement that the commercial day had officially begun. Next came the broom. Sweeping the front step and the patch of pavement before his shop was not just about cleanliness. It was a symbolic act. He was clearing away the detritus of the night, the mud, the horse manure, the discarded oyster shells, to create a clean, inviting path for respectable trade. A dirty step suggested a neglected business. His window display was his silent salesman. With meticulous care, he would arrange his wares behind the glass. A grocer might artfully pyramid bright oranges or stack tins of tea with their colorful labels facing out. A draper would fold bolts of cloth to show their richest hues. This was a moment of theater, a curated illusion of plenty designed to catch the eye of a passing housewife or clerk. His entire morning depended on networks that operated in the dark. Well before he arrived, the city's wholesale markets had been a frenzy of activity. If he sold fruit, flowers, or vegetables, his supply had come from the great barrows of Covent Garden, purchased by him or a trusted porter in the chaotic, lantern-lit hours between 3 and 5 a.m. A baker's ovens would have been fired hours earlier by a journeyman. This reliance on pre-dawn logistics meant his shop's success was often determined by decisions made while he was still asleep. Attracting the first customers was critical. The early morning rush came from servants on errands for their households, procuring the day's fresh provisions. A shopkeeper needed a reputation for quality and fair measure to secure these lucrative, regular accounts. Once the door was open, his world became one of sustained performance. He would stand behind his counter for 10, 12, even 14 hours, constantly engaged. There was no sitting down that would imply idleness. Every transaction was a potential negotiation, a polite haggling over price, or a discussion of credit for a trusted customer. His manner had to be perpetually attentive, courteous, and patient, regardless of his own fatigue or the customer's temper. His shop was not just a place of business, but a pillar of the neighborhood's social fabric, and his morning ritual of opening up was a daily renewal of that contract. The shopkeeper's polite haggling was a world of genteel commerce, a universe away from the sound that truly ruled the industrial dawn. It was not a church bell, but a steam-powered scream. The factory whistle tore through the thin walls of cramped brick tenements, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the chest. It did not invite, it commanded. For the mill worker, the weaver, the metal worker, this shriek was the only alarm clock that mattered, yanking entire families from exhausted sleep into another day of survival. Their morning was not a ritual, it was a frantic scramble. In a single room that might house parents and several children, there was no space for separate washing or dressing. Everyone rose at once in the gray half-light, pulling on coarse, patched work clothes still stiff with the sweat and grime of yesterday's shift. A meager breakfast was swallowed standing up, if there was any at all. Perhaps a thick slice of bread, dry or spread with a smear of dripping. A pot of weak, bitter tea, brewed from leaves used and reused until the water barely changed color, provided a scant burst of warmth. There were no servants to draw water here. A single shared basin in the courtyard, its surface often skimmed with ice in winter, served an entire floor. Cleanliness was a luxury time did not permit. Then came the trudge. They spilled into streets still dark, joining a river of shadowy figures all flowing in one direction, toward the mills and foundries that belched perpetual smoke in the sky. The air here had a taste and texture all its own, a thick, acrid mixture of coal dust, chemical fumes from tanneries or dye works, and the sickly sweet smell of the breweries. It coated the throat and left a gritty film on the skin by mid-morning. There was no conversation, only the muffled sound of countless boots on cobblestones, a summer procession. Their destination loomed like a fortress, a vast, windowless block of blackened brick, its chimneys piercing the gloom like prison towers. The final, defining moment of this morning was the clocking in station. A worker would take a personal brass token or a numbered card and slot it into a timing machine that stamped the exact minute of arrival. 1 minute late, and the gate might be locked, the token rejected. That meant a half-day's lost wages, or worse, a fine deducted from an already pitiful weekly pay packet. Punctuality here was not about politeness, it was about economic life or death. Once inside, the true nature of this morning revealed itself. This was not a beginning filled with potential. It was the start of a sentence to be served. The shift stretched ahead, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of deafening, monotonous, and profoundly dangerous labor. A spinner in a cotton mill would breathe air thick with floating fibers that destroyed lungs, while tending machines whose unguarded belts could snag a sleeve and pull in an arm in an instant. A child crawling beneath whirling machinery to gather loose cotton risked a crushed skull. For a puddler in an ironworks, the heat was so intense it warped the world into a shimmering haze. Each movement a battle against exhaustion and scorching metal. There were no breaks for leisure, only a few minutes to bolt down a piece of bread brought in a pocket. The factory whistle that began the day would not sound again until it ended, when workers emerged, bleary-eyed and coated in filth, to make the same trudge homeward in darkness. Their morning offered no illusion of control, no crafted persona, no polished silver. It was a raw transaction of time for survival, a brutal reminder that for millions, the Victorian dawn was not a gentle awakening, but the start of a daily siege against poverty. And as that factory whistle faded in the din of the day, another, more solitary figure was already well into his own morning's work, one that required not a crowd, but a profound and necessary silence. While the factory whistle imposed a grim uniformity, the city's true morning symphony was improvised, rising from the streets themselves. This was the chorus of the hawkers, a cacophony of survival that painted the dawn in sound. Each cry was a distinct instrument, a living advertisement for a world without posters or newspapers. The sharp, clear call of milk-o from the milkmaid balancing her yoke with 2 heavy pails promised freshness. Her route was a lifeline for houses without cold storage, her arrival timed to the minute before the breakfast kettle boiled. Then came the softer, more melancholy jingle of a handbell, signaling the muffin man. He carried his wares on a wooden tray balanced on his head, covered with a green baize cloth to keep them warm, selling sweet, doughy bread to clerks and servants hurrying to work. These sounds marked the hours. The milkmaid meant early morning, the muffin man mid-morning, the lavender seller afternoon. For those inside grand houses, these calls were the background rhythm of domestic life, a human clock they set their routines by. But other sounds carried a darker message. The haunting 2-note cry of the chimney sweep, sweep, echoed up from the pavement. It was a sound that made mothers pull their children closer, for everyone knew what it meant. Behind the man, often a master sweep himself blackened with soot, would trail his climbing boy, a child small enough to wriggle up the narrow, hot flues. His was a life measured in suffocating darkness and the constant risk of being stuck or burned. The call was an advertisement for a necessary evil, a service born from the very coal fires that warmed the elegant parlors above. Equally mournful was the ragged call of the rag and bone man, collecting the discarded scraps of the city. He traded old clothes, broken furniture, and even bones for a few pennies or a simple child's toy, a whirligig made from a bone button. His cart was a museum of urban decay, and his cry was the sound of everything the prosperous world tried to throw away, finding one last fractional value. For these sellers, the morning was not a prelude to the day, it was the entire performance. They lived hand to mouth, their earnings measured in pence. A rainy day could mean no sales and no supper. Their voices were their capital, strained and hoarse by afternoon from constant use. They navigated a complex, unwritten geography, knowing which streets tolerated their cries and which would bring the police. This sonic landscape was the true democratic pulse of the city, a network of need and service that connected the attic of the beggar to the basement of the duke. It was commerce stripped bare of pretense, a raw human noise that the march of progress, the very factories that employed their customers, would eventually silence. And as the din of the street sellers reached its peak, another morning ritual, one of absolute silence and profound focus, was reaching its own delicate conclusion behind the closed doors of 1,000 studies. The street sellers' cry for rags and bones faded at the threshold of a very different establishment. Inside the public house, the morning light revealed a scene of quiet reckoning. The air hung thick, a stale cocktail of yesterday's tobacco smoke, spilled beer, and the faint, sour tang of humanity. This was the publican's world in the raw hours before opening, a daily resurrection from the night's debris. His first task was a battle against evidence. Sawdust, scattered across the floor to soak up spills and worse, was now a damp, matted carpet of filth. He swept it into foul heaps, each scoop telling a story of overturned pints and muddy boots. Then came the spittoons, these brass or porcelain vessels, placed for men chewing tobacco, were the most visceral chore. They required emptying and scouring, a process no amount of perfume could truly mask. Every glass, sticky with the residue of porter and gin, had to be washed by hand in steaming, soapy water, then polished to a sparkle that promised freshness anew. Windows were thrown open, doors propped ajar, in a futile attempt to chase the entrenched smell of the night into the street. This cleaning was not just about hygiene, it was a moral and legal necessity. Public houses operated under strict licensing laws. A magistrate could revoke a license for disorderly conduct or unsanitary conditions. The publican's morning scrub was therefore an act of preservation, erasing the traces of revelry to present a house of order by 11 o'clock, the legal hour for morning opening. And when those doors finally swung open, they welcomed a specific and telling clientele. The first customers were often laborers, dock workers, bricklayers, carters, men facing a day of brutal physical toil. They came not for camaraderie, but for a chemical adjustment. A fortifier or eye-opener, usually a shot of gin or a thick stout, was a common, if unspoken, start to the working day. It was a practice born of cold, pain, and habit, a way to numb the aches from yesterday and steel the nerves for today. For the publican, this trade was a financial boon but a social tightrope. He served a real need, yet fed a demon that Victorian society was increasingly anxious about. Temperance movements were gaining power, preaching that alcohol was the root of poverty and domestic violence. The morning drinker, silhouetted in the pub doorway, was a walking contradiction, a man seeking strength in the very thing that could ensure his weakness. The public house at dawn was thus a liminal space, caught between necessity and vice, between the grime of truth and the polished sheen of survival. And as the clock ticked toward noon, another morning ritual reached its peak, one that required not a stiff drink, but absolute clarity of mind and a steady, unflinching hand. The surgeon's steady hand relied on a clarity that began with something we take for granted: clean water. For the Victorian household, water was not a utility, it was a daily siege. In the grandest townhouses, a marvel of engineering might exist: a tank in the attic fed by a hand pump from a basement cistern, allowing gravity to pull water down through lead pipes to a single tap, often in the scullery. This was a luxury of the highest order. For the overwhelming majority, water came from a shared pump in the courtyard, a well at the end of the street, or was purchased by the bucket from a water carrier, a man who made his living hauling the city's most precious commodity from door to door. Every drop had to be carried, heated, and used with extreme economy. The morning wash was therefore a miniature, precise ceremony. In the bedroom, the washstand was the centerpiece. Upon it sat a large ceramic bowl and a matching water jug, often decorated with floral patterns that tried to soften the chore's nature. A housemaid would have already filled the jug with hot water carried up from the kitchen range. You would pour a few inches in the bowl, wetting a cloth or sponge. Soap was a hard, often gritty cake, and you lathered sparingly. The wash was not a full immersion, it was a targeted application. You washed the face, the neck, the hands, and perhaps the underarms, using the same water, which grew progressively cloudier. This was the daily reality, a splash and dash approach to cleanliness. The concept of a full-body bath was almost unthinkable as a regular event. For the middle and working classes, a bath was a major logistical operation, typically a weekly or, for many, a monthly undertaking. This required the infamous hip bath, a small, portable tin tub shaped like a slanted chair. It would be brought into the kitchen or before the bedroom fire, and then the exhausting procession of buckets began. Servants or family members would haul kettle after kettle of hot water to fill it just enough to sit in. The bather would then crouch in this shallow pool, washing quickly before the water grew cold. The whole process was so laborious that it could not be frequent. This fundamental limitation created a society that lived with a different sensory landscape. Body odor was a constant shared fact of life, not a personal failing. The response was not to remove it through daily washing, but to mask it. This is where the Victorian arsenal of perfumes and powders comes into focus. Perfumes were heavy and floral, designed to overpower rather than blend. Scented sachets of lavender or rose petals were tucked into linen cupboards and clothing drawers. Women might wear pomanders, small perforated metal balls containing spices and ambergris on a chain. And powder was everywhere. Talcum powder, often scented with violet or rose, was dusted over the body after a rare bath to absorb moisture. But more commonly, people used powder directly on their hair and clothing to absorb the oils and odors of the day. A lady might powder her neck and bosom. A gentleman might sprinkle a scented powder on his shirt. These were not secrets, but open strategies in a shared battle against the inevitable. The morning washstand ritual, then, was a compromise. It was a symbolic act of purification, a nod toward civility within the stark limits of physics and infrastructure. It maintained the illusion of freshness, while the deeper truth lingered just beneath the starched collar, a reminder that for all their social refinement, Victorians were engaged in a constant, intimate negotiation with the realities of their own bodies and the sheer, back-breaking weight of water itself. The morning wash was a battle against the day's first layer of grime, but it was only a prelude to a far more fundamental struggle. Every home, from the grandest Mayfair mansion to the humblest cellar dwelling, faced the same inescapable question: what to do with the body's most basic refuse. For the vast majority, the answer lay at the bottom of the garden, in a small wooden shed that was both a necessity and a nightmare, the privy. This was not a flushing water closet, but a simple hole in a wooden seat, positioned over a brick-lined pit. The only concession to comfort was a scattering of ash or dry earth, tossed in after use to dampen the smell and absorb moisture, a system known as an earth closet. Inside the house, especially at night, the chamber pot reigned supreme, made of porcelain or tin, and often discreetly stored in a cupboard or under the bed. It was a private vessel for a private need. In wealthy households, a maid would face the unenviable task of emptying and cleaning these pots each morning, carrying the contents through the house to the outdoor privy or a designated waste heap called a midden. For the poor in crowded tenements, the options were far more dire. A single privy might serve dozens of families, its pit overflowing and foul, while chamber pots were often simply emptied out of a window into the courtyard or street below, with a shouted warning of garde-à-l'eau. This was the daily reality of sanitation, an intimate, repulsive problem that festered in the background of every polished morning routine. But just before dawn, when the city was at its quietest, a special workforce moved in to manage this collective crisis. They were the night soil men, and their job was as vital as it was reviled. Operating in the dead of night and into the early morning hours, they arrived at homes with contracts for service. With quiet efficiency, they would lift the privy seat, shovel the accumulated waste from the pit below into large wooden tubs, and carry these reeking containers to a waiting cart. The men were often covered in filth, and the stench that followed them was so potent it was said to cling to the streets long after they had passed. They were socially invisible, despised by all, yet without them, the city would have literally drowned in its own waste. This fragile, nocturnal system was the thin line between a functioning metropolis and a cesspool, and that line was constantly breaking. The contents of those night soil carts had to go somewhere. Sometimes it was sold as fertilizer to farmers on the city's outskirts, but often it was simply dumped into the nearest watercourse, directly into the River Thames. As London's population exploded, the river became an open sewer, a sluggish, brown flow of human and industrial waste. The consequences were catastrophic. Cholera, a waterborne disease, swept through the city in repeated waves, killing tens of thousands. Doctors and scientists argued over how it spread, many blaming foul air or miasma from the putrid river. The crisis reached its unforgettable peak in the summer of 1858, during the Great Stink. An unusually hot spell baked the exposed sewage on the Thames banks, releasing a smell so overpowering it brought the business of government to a halt. The curtains of the Houses of Parliament were soaked in lime chloride in a futile attempt to block the odor, and politicians fled the chamber, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. This was the turning point. The sheer, unbearable physical reality of the problem could no longer be ignored. The Great Stink, born from a million neglected morning rituals, finally forced the Victorians to confront the hidden cost of their growth, setting in motion an engineering revolution that would change the city and the modern world forever. The Great Stink was a crisis written in the air, but the morning's true headlines were printed in ink. Long before the first commuter bought his paper, a hidden industry had been thundering through the night. In the basements of Fleet Street, massive steam-powered printing presses shook the very foundations, their rhythmic pounding like a mechanical heartbeat for the city. Rollers turned, feeding endless sheets of paper, while typesetters, their fingers stained black, worked at frantic speed to lock the last pieces of metal type into place. These men were composing the first draft of the day's reality, transforming telegrams from the Crimea, police reports from Whitecapel, and gossip from the latest parliamentary debate into columns of crisp, smudgy text. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the first damp, fragrant sheets were tumbling off the presses, carrying the scent of fresh ink and urgent news into the cold air. This is where the newsboys took over. They were an army of the dawn, a ragged battalion of children and teenagers who descended on the printing offices. For a few pence, they bought a bundle of papers on credit, their profit coming from each penny they could sell them for on the street. It was a high-stakes gamble. A popular headline meant quick sales and a good breakfast. A slow news day could leave them hungry and in debt to the papermen. They fanned out across the city, each claiming a strategic corner or a busy omnibus stop. Their voices, often hoarse and breaking, cut through the fog with practiced cries. They didn't just say the paper's name, they sold the story. Extra. Extra, read all about it. Fatal accident on the railway, or shocking details of the Mayfair burglary. They were masters of the hook, turning complex events into a few sensational words that would loosen a coin from a passerby's pocket. The content they hawked was a mirror held up to Victorian society, cracked and revealing. The front page was typically a dense forest of small print advertisements, but inside lay the real draw. There were detailed accounts of political speeches, shaping public opinion on everything from foreign wars to the price of bread. Crime reports were consumed with a mixture of horror and fascination, offering moral tales and thrilling narratives. Society gossip columns, often written under pseudonyms, provided a glimpse into the glittering, inaccessible world of balls and country house parties, allowing a clerk or a shopkeeper to tut at the scandals of their so-called betters over their morning toast. The paper was not just information. It was the first mass entertainment of the day, a shared cultural touchstone. At the breakfast table, a gentleman might read aloud a pertinent political article, while his wife might later peruse the fashion notes or the serialized novel running in the back pages. For the working man who could afford a shared copy, it offered a connection to a world beyond his factory gate. This daily ritual of purchase and perusal created a new kind of community, a public that was informed, or at least felt informed, by the same stories at the same time. The newsboy's shout was the starting pistol for that shared experience. He was the vital, final link in a chain that stretched from the telegraph wire to the breakfast nook, a living notification system in a world before digital alerts. His success and the newspaper's power depended entirely on the urgency of that morning moment. Yesterday's news was worthless, lining trunks or lighting fires. The value was in the now, in the fresh, in-kai account of a world that seemed to change between dusk and dawn. As the last papers were sold and the boys dispersed to other odd jobs, or to simply rest their raw throats, the city had been armed with its narrative for the day, a story composed in the dark and shouted into the light. While the newsboy shouted the day's rigid narrative, a different story was being composed in silence, behind a north-facing window in Chelsea. Here, the morning did not begin with a bell, a whistle, or a servant's knock. For the artist in his studio, the day arrived on a beam of pale, diffuse light creeping across a dusty floor. He might wake at 9 or 10 or even 11, a schedule that was itself a quiet rebellion against the industrial clock. His first conscious act was not to consult a pocket watch, but to assess the sky. The quality of the light was everything. A clear, harsh sun was useless to him, bleaching out color and casting clumsy shadows. What he needed was that soft, luminous gray, the particular glow of a London morning filtered through high cloud, which revealed subtle hues and gentle gradations of tone. This was his raw material, and it was fleeting. He would rise quickly, his own servant, pulling on a paint-splattered smock over yesterday's clothes. Breakfast was a solitary, functional affair, often prepared on a small spirit lamp in the corner of the studio. A cup of strong black coffee, a piece of bread and cheese eaten standing at the easel. This was fuel, not ceremony. There were no layers of social armor to don, no performance for an audience. The only performance was for the blank canvas, and the only judge was the light. His studio was a temple to purposeful chaos. Canvases leaned against walls, brushes stood in jam jars clouded with turpentine, and the smell of linseed oil and charcoal hung permanently in the air. This disorder was not laziness, but a curated space where inspiration was allowed to linger, where a half-finished sketch from yesterday could immediately catch the eye and command the hand. The Bohemian morning was built on this principle of direct engagement. There was no valet, no maid, no secretary to mediate between the man and his work. He mixed his own paints, stretched his own canvases, and cleaned his own brushes. This physical connection to the process was essential. It was a rejection of the Victorian ideal of the gentleman, whose value came from managing others' labor. The artist's value came from the labor of his own hands and the vision of his own eyes. His entire schedule was inverted. While the city reached its peak of frantic commerce by midday, he was often just entering his deepest state of concentration, chasing that perfect window of illumination. Appointments were forgotten, meals were skipped, and social calls were seen as intrusions upon this sacred, productive solitude. This lifestyle was a conscious, if sometimes precarious, choice. It meant poverty often, and the disapproval of a society that equated success with regular hours and a growing bank balance. But it also meant freedom. The artist's morning was not a series of obligations to others, but a daily negotiation between his inner vision and the external world, mediated by that most precious and intangible commodity, the perfect fading light. In his rejection of the alarm clock, he was asserting a different kind of time, one measured not in minutes, but in moments of clarity. A different kind of professional was also assessing the morning light. For the pickpocket or dipper, dawn was not a time for waking, but for strategic positioning. He moved through the thickening crowds at omnibus stops and railway termini with a predator's patience, his eyes not on the sky but on the details of human vulnerability. A gentleman distracted by his newspaper, his watch chain glinting invitingly from an open waistcoat. A harried housewife clutching her purse too tightly, marking its location for any observing eye. The morning rush was his hunting ground, the jostle and press of bodies providing the perfect cover for a swift, practiced dip into a pocket or a snatch at her reticule. His success depended on an intimate understanding of the respectable world's routines, turning their punctuality into his opportunity. In shadowed alleys, the night's takings changed hands. A thief would approach a shop that seemed perfectly ordinary, a pawnbroker's or a second-hand clothing store, but with a subtle signal, a particular knock, a coded phrase, he would be admitted to the back room. This was the domain of the fence, the underworld's merchant banker. In the cool morning light, He appraised stolen watches, silk handkerchiefs, and silver spoons with a dispassionate eye, haggling over a price that was a fraction of the item's worth. His shop was a perversion of the honest tradesman's ritual. His opening hours welcomed not customers, but suppliers of illicit goods, laundering the night's crimes into daytime currency. And slipping through the gray streets, often as the honest workers streamed in the opposite direction, were the women returning from their night's labor. Exhaustion etched their faces as they sought a few hours of fitful sleep in rented rooms, their morning a hollow inversion of the domestic ideal, a time for rest when the world awoke, and for solitude when families gathered. This parallel world thrived on the same clock, but obeyed none of its moral laws. The Victorians' profound fear of crime was not just about stolen property, it was a terror of this permeable boundary. The thief looked like a gentleman, the fence operated behind a legitimate front. The fallen woman walked the same streets as the respectable wife. This eroding of visible difference made the city feel like a maze of deceit. Newspapers fed this anxiety with sensational accounts of garrottings in foggy lanes and burglaries in Mayfair, transforming specific crimes into a generalized atmosphere of dread. The wealthy carried concealed weapons like life preservers, heavy lead-filled clubs, and installed newfangled locks on their doors. This pervasive fear was the dark counterpart to the era's celebrated progress. For every well-lit street and efficient police patrol, there seemed to be a deeper, darker alley where a different set of rules applied. The criminal's dawn was a reminder that the social order, so meticulously performed in every polished hallway and timed commute, was terrifyingly fragile. And as the city fully shook off the night, one final morning ritual commenced, a quiet act of devotion that sought to fortify that very order against the chaos always pressing at the door. The criminal's dawn thrived on moral shadows, but in countless homes, the first light was claimed by a higher authority. In pious households, especially among the middle and upper classes, the day did not truly begin until the family gathered for morning prayers. This was not a private moment of individual reflection, but a formal domestic ceremony. Led by the patriarch, the family and often the senior servants would assemble in the drawing room or dining room after breakfast. They would kneel on hard, unforgiving furniture as the master of the house read a passage from the family Bible, its leather cover worn smooth from daily use. His voice would fill the quiet room with psalms or proverbs, followed by a solemn, extemporized prayer asking for divine guidance and protection through the coming hours. This ritual was a public reinforcement of the domestic hierarchy. God's authority flowed through the father, and his family's obedience in this spiritual matter mirrored their submission to his worldly rule. It set a tone of piety, order, and self-discipline before the secular business of the day could commence. For children and servants, it was a daily reminder that their behavior was being observed not just by their parents or employers, but by an all-seeing eye. This moral framework reached its zenith every seventh day, transforming the very fabric of time. Sunday, the Sabbath, was a fortress of stillness in a week of relentless motion. From Saturday night onward, a palpable change descended. All preparation was aimed at avoiding work on the Lord's day. Food was cooked in advance, leading to the tradition of the Sunday cold supper. Fires were banked, clothes were laid out, and toys were put away. When Sunday morning arrived, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The factory whistles were silent. The omnibuses and trains ran on reduced schedules, if at all. The shouts of street hawkers vanished. This imposed quiet was not peaceful, but profoundly austere. In the home, The normal cheerful clatter of the kitchen range was absent. Meals were cold and simple, often centered on a joint of meat cooked the day before, accompanied by pickles, bread, and perhaps a cold pudding. Even the act of reheating food or boiling a kettle for tea could be frowned upon by the strictly observant, as it constituted kindling of fire, a form of work. The atmosphere was one of subdued reverence, often felt by children as a crushing boredom. Entertainment was forbidden. No novels, no games, no music other than hymns. The day was structured around church attendance, often twice, with long intervals at home for Bible reading and catechism. A child caught laughing too loudly or playing with a toy might be sharply reprimanded for breaking the Sabbath peace. This strictness was the ultimate expression of the Victorian moral compass. It demonstrated that their drive for progress and productivity had a limit, a weekly acknowledgement of a power greater than industry. The silent Sunday morning was a weekly recalibration, an attempt to assert spiritual values over material ones, to remind a society hurtling into the modern age that some rhythms were not theirs to command. Yet even this day of rest was policed by an invisible clock, one that ticked not in minutes, but in generations, quietly shaping the bodies and futures of the very children kneeling in prayer. For the invalid, the morning bell did not signal a beginning, but another slow rotation in a private orbit of stillness. Theirs was a world of drawn curtains and hushed voices, a room deliberately dimmed to soothe fevered eyes and shield a weakened constitution from the harshness of the day. This was a common shadow in the Victorian home, where a simple infection could become a lifelong ailment and recovery was measured in weeks or months, not days. The morning here was not about progress, but about preservation. It began with a careful assessment conducted by the patient themselves or a watchful nurse, a catalog of symptoms, a note of the night's rest, the quality of the cough, the precise location of the ache. This internal report was critical, for it would soon be delivered to the highest domestic authority on such matters, the visiting physician. His arrival was an event, announced by the sound of his carriage on the gravel and the solemn tread of his steps on the stairs. The doctor did not hurry. He entered the sick room as a figure of science and slight mystery, placing his top hat and medical bag with deliberate care. The examination was often surprisingly brief, relying heavily on the patient's own account and a few key observations: the pulse taken with a pocket watch, the tongue inspected, the chest listened to with an ear pressed directly to the nitrate, the precursor to the stethoscope. Diagnosis was an art of pattern recognition in an age before X-rays or blood tests, and treatment reflected a fundamental philosophy of balance. The body was seen as a system that had become overstimulated or depleted, and the goal was to restore its equilibrium. This is where the morning's most potent ritual occurred, the dosing. From his bag, the physician might produce a bottle of tonic, its contents often more powerful than anyone truly understood. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was the era's universal remedy. It was prescribed for pain, for coughs, for diarrhea, for anxiety, and for sheer exhaustion. A few drops in a glass of water promised relief from suffering, and for many, it delivered a profound, addictive peace. It was sold freely at the chemist's shop, and its use in the nursery to quiet restless children was tragically commonplace. Alongside this chemical comfort came the culinary prescriptions. Nourishment was not about pleasure, but about repair. The invalid's breakfast was a bland, liquid testament to this belief. Beef tea, a thin, strained broth made by steaming shreds of lean beef, was considered the ultimate strengthening food. providing vital essence without overtaxing the digestion. Arrowroot, a bland starch mixed with milk or water, offered gentle sustenance. Even a slice of toast was meticulously stripped of its crust and cut into precise fingers for easy, delicate consumption. This entire careful performance, from the darkened room to the measured spoonful, reveals a deep Victorian preoccupation with the fragility of the body and the ever-present threat of decline. Health was not a default state, but a precarious achievement that required constant management. The sick room became a theater for exercising control where it was still possible, imposing order on the chaos of illness through strict routine and domestic science. It was also a space of profound vulnerability, where the strong patriarch or the bustling matron was reduced to a dependent child, relying on the expertise of others and the dubious mercy of their era's pharmacy. The invalid's quiet mourning was a silent counterpoint to the city's roaring industry, a reminder that for all their ambition, the Victorians lived in bodies just as susceptible to breaking as our own. And while one body was coaxed back to life with beef tea and opium, another, far smaller form of life was beginning its own perilous journey into the world, in a room where the morning's tension was not measured in minutes, but in breaths. The invalid's fragile peace depended on a world of slow, careful tending, but another kind of message was now slicing through the morning with ruthless speed. It arrived not with a postman's tread, but with a sharp, metallic clicking from a wooden box on the wall. This was the electric telegraph, and its language was a staccato code of dots and dashes that bypassed paper, pen, and human travel entirely. For the first time in human history, urgent information could cross hundreds of miles in minutes, not days. A businessman in London could receive a commodity price from Liverpool before his breakfast tea grew cold. A government minister could learn of a diplomatic crisis unfolding in Paris almost as it happened. The telegram, a strip of paper with printed words, was the physical proof of this miracle, often delivered by a special messenger directly to the home or office, its very presence signaling importance and immediacy. This instantaneity shattered the old rhythms of correspondence. Where a letter was a considered composition, a telegram was a distilled essence. Every word cost money, so phrasing became brutally efficient. Stop, not a period, but a paid for command for absolute clarity. The very structure of communication was being rewired for speed, compressing courtesies and formalities into raw data. Yet this revolution existed in a strange, overlapping reality. On the same silver tray that held the crisp telegram, there would still lie the fat, sealed envelopes of handwritten letters, with their flowing scripts and personal wax seals. Society was caught in a profound transition. You might telegraph a stockbroker with a buy order at 10 a.m., and then sit down at noon to pen a long, newswire letter to a cousin in the country, describing the weather and family gossip in paragraphs meant to be savored weeks later. The morning now had two distinct pulses, the frantic, electric heartbeat of the telegraph and the slow, steady circulation of the postal blood. This duality changed how people experienced news itself. A newspaper report of a distant event was no longer just a recounting of something that happened last week. It could be an analysis of something that happened yesterday, informed by telegraphic dispatches. The world suddenly felt smaller, more connected, yet also more demanding. The expectation for a rapid response, for instant decisions based on fresh information, began to seed a new kind of morning anxiety. The luxury of time for reflection, once enforced by distance, was being erased by a wire and a battery. The quiet sanctity of the breakfast hour could now be punctured by a slip of paper that demanded your attention, your capital, or your action before you had finished your toast. It was the dawn of the real-time age, and with it came a subtle, relentless pressure to keep pace with a world that no longer waited for the mail coach. The telegraph's urgent click demanded a different kind of fuel, and the Victorian breakfast table was ready to supply it. This was not a meal of light pastries, but a foundation of robust, often pungent flavors designed to fortify the body for the demands of a long, strenuous day. At the sideboard's center, you might find a chafing dish of deviled kidneys, their rich, gamey scent sharpened with cayenne pepper and mustard, a wake-up call for the palate. Nearby, a bloater, a whole smoked herring with a distinctive, oily aroma, offered a powerful dose of protein. For those seeking something even more assertive, there was Scotch woodcock, a deceptively simple name for a potent dish of creamy scrambled eggs piled on toast, lavishly topped with a paste of minced anchovies and capers. Each bite was a declaration against the morning's fragility, a deliberate consumption of strong, sustaining things. But the true sovereign of the morning was not on a plate, it was in the cup. Tea was the undisputed national beverage, the ritual that structured the domestic day. Yet the tea leaves reaching most households were rarely pure. Adulteration was a rampant, open secret. Unscrupulous merchants would bulk out expensive leaves with the sweepings of factory floors, with used leaves that had been dried and re-dyed with poisonous chemicals like lead chromate or Prussian blue to restore their color, or with the leaves of other plants altogether. A pinch of facing, a mixture of gypsum and ferrous sulfate, could make stale brown leaves appear freshly green and lustrous. This meant every sip was a small gamble, a blend of comfort and concealed danger. Coffee, while less popular than tea, had its own fraught journey. What was sold as coffee was often a blend containing ground chicory root, burnt acorns, or even roasted peas and wheat, additives that stretched the expensive bean but created a bitter, gritty brew. The first task of the morning, then, was often one of wary discernment, trusting your grocer not to poison you with your own comfort. The bread beside your plate told an immediate social story. For the wealthy, it was manchet, a fine, white, wheaten bread baked in small, soft rolls. Its purity a symbol of a refined digestion untouched by coarse fare. For the middle classes, a standard white loaf was the goal, representing freedom from the dark, coarse breads of poverty. For the working poor, bread was a dense, dark substance made from cheaper, less sifted rye or barley flour, often adulterated with alum to make it whiter and heavier, so it could be sold by deceptive weight. Your daily bread was a direct indicator of your place in the world, eaten off fine china, sturdy pottery, or straight from the hand. Yet even this ancient hierarchy was beginning to crackle with something new by the era's end. From America came whispers of a revolutionary morning idea, breakfast cereal. The first wave was not the sweet, puffed corn of later years, but austere health food. Granula, created by Dr. James Caleb Jackson in 1863, was a testament to edible virtue. It consisted of dense, rock-hard nuggets of twice-baked graham flour dough that had to be soaked in milk overnight to be merely chewable. It was marketed not for taste, but as a digestive corrective to the rich, meat-heavy breakfasts of the time, a puritanical rebellion on a plate. This shift from heavy animal proteins to manufactured grain marked a quiet turning point, the first hint that the Victorian morning, with all its robust certainty, was being questioned by a new gospel of science, efficiency, and light. That single morning stretched across a chasm of experience as wide as the empire itself. From the valet's silent shave to the factory whistle's scream, from the governess's lonely grammar lesson to the newsboy's frantic shout, Every ritual was a brick in the invisible wall of class. The gentleman's effortless ease was purchased with the housemaid's aching back. The lady's sculpted silhouette depended on the rigid cage of her corset and the social cage of her expectations. Technology measured this divide in brutal terms, the pocket watch dictating a clerk's fate, the telegraph speeding capital across continents, while the night soil man still hauled the city's waste away in a reeking cart. Each dawn was a performance of identity, a desperate cling to stability in a world being remade by steam, smoke, and startling new ideas. So what does our own morning reveal? We tap screens instead of pulling bell ropes. We commute by car rather than omnibus. We fret over emails instead of calling cards. Yet the architecture of our days is no less telling. The frantic scroll through news feeds mirrors the Victorians' anxiety over the morning paper. Our obsession with quick, efficient breakfasts continues their shift toward convenience. The silence of a home heated with a flick of a switch has erased the army of servants who once rose in the dark to light the fires. Our rituals are built on different technologies, but they still map our values, our stresses, and our hidden hierarchies with perfect clarity. One day, a historian might sift through the digital dust of our era. What will they deduce from our pre-dawn gym sessions, our rushed coffee, our simultaneous connection and isolation? They will see a society still negotiating time, class, and self-presentation, just on a new stage. The Victorians whispered their secrets in the rustle of a silk gown and the soot on a collar. We broadcast ours in 100 different ways. So the next time your alarm sounds, pause for just a moment. You are not just starting your day, you are writing a tiny daily chapter in the story of our age. What do you think your morning routine says about the world we live in now? I would love to hear your thoughts, or any stories of how your own family's mornings have changed through the generations, in the comments below.